Today, I'm going to the Sullenberger Aviation Museum on the Charlotte Douglas International Airport. I'm here at the intersection of Morrisfield Drive and Minuteman Way. And the sign says, "That way." This museum has been around for over 33 years. It's gone through a couple of different names and moved to several locations around the airport. Finally, in 2024, it got a permanent home, which included a purpose-built museum building to display and protect its collection of aircraft and gear. I am very pleased to see that this large gray hangar has been incorporated into the museum and has been nicely restored. This hangar is the only surviving building from the airport's 1937 original opening. It had fallen into a terrible state of disrepair and was heading for a date with a wrecking ball. Now it's part of the museum, and rightly so, as the building itself is a piece of Charlotte's aviation history. I'm inside the museum's gift shop, where I found this fantastic painting of a Piedmont DC-3. And while I can say with confidence, this is not a scene from the Charlotte airport, but my gosh, it is absolutely fantastic. It beautifully captures the excitement people had for airplanes and aviation in the early days of the industry. I've entered the main display building, and I am not disappointed. Hiding in the back there, I see the Airbus that ended up in the Hudson River in January 2009. One of the first aircraft on display is this retired F-14D model, commonly called the Tomcat. Made famous by the original 1986 film Top Gun, the F-14 served the U.S. Navy from 1974 until 2006, when it was replaced by the F-18 Hornet. Designed in the 1960s, this remains a great-looking aircraft. Built by the Grumman Corporation to be primarily a carrier-based aircraft. At max loadout, she weighed in at about 74,000 pounds. Its 20mm M61 cannon could push out a blistering 6,000 rounds a minute. However, with the plane carrying a max load of 676 rounds, the pilots could and normally did lower the rate of fire, setting it to 50, 100, or 200 rounds per trigger pull so as not to burn through the entire ammunition supply. Next up is an F-4 Phantom, sometimes called Old Smoky, or also the Flying Brick. Here's a very well-used F-4 cockpit on display. This is a British-made Martin Baker ejection seat, which was standard in the F-4. Next to it is the antenna for the aircraft's APQ-72 Air Intercept Radar System, which was tucked behind the aircraft's nose. You see, the F-4 was mainly a missile and bomb carrier. What it did not have is a gun. Pilots had a problem with that. In the back there is an F9F Grumman Cougar. Its heyday was between the Korean and Vietnam Wars. It was born in the 1950s, a time of rapid aircraft development. By the time fighting broke out in Vietnam in the 1960s, the Cougar had been replaced by newer designs, so it never saw much in the way of aerial combat. This particular aircraft was used as an aerial reconnaissance platform. Overhead is a Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. This design dates to 1943. That's World War II. And it was delivered to the U.S. Army. That's right, the Army. You've got to remember that during World War II, there was no U.S. Air Force. It was the U.S. Army Air Force, a division of the U.S. Army that was flying airplanes. The United States Air Force would not be formed until after the end of World War II in 1947. Here's the P-80's engine, an early jet engine with a centrifugal compressor. Today, most jet aircraft have axial flow compressors, but many helicopter and turboprop engines still have centrifugal style compressors. Next is an A-7 Corsair, a carrier-based aircraft that began service with the U.S. Navy in 1967 and was used throughout the air war over Vietnam. This is a heads-up display, or HUD, which the Corsair was one of the first aircraft to have a full HUD system, allowing pilots to keep their eyes outside the aircraft and on the target. By 1991, the A-7 had been retired from the U.S. military. Farther down is this A-4 Skyhawk, another Vietnam War aircraft. And to the right is an F-102 Dagger, or in this case a YF-102, which was one of the prototypes Convair built while developing the Dagger. Since only 4 prototypes were built, I'd consider this a very rare aircraft. Nearby in a case, with among other things, is a flight data recorder, which is painted international orange, just like every other flight data and cockpit voice recorder I've ever seen, which makes me wonder why the news media loves to refer to these devices as black boxes. Next to the FDR is one of World War II's biggest secrets, a Norden bomb sight. Over here is an old Cessna 150. Cessna ceased production of the 150 in 1977 when they replaced it with the 152. Here's a very vintage Link instrument trainer. This looks like an old Boeing 727 procedures trainer. Let's go inside. Flight engineers panel, which I was once pretty familiar with. Engine instruments. Back over on the engineers panel, controls for the 3 engine-driven generators. Below are fuel system controls. This exhibit is perhaps one of the museum's biggest attractions. The U.S. Airways A320 Airbus that ditched in the Hudson River on 15 January of 2009, dubbed the Miracle on the Hudson. The flight had just departed runway 4 at LaGuardia Airport in New York City. As they climbed through 2,800 feet, the aircraft encountered a flock of Canadian geese. The large birds struck the aircraft. Several were ingested into the engines, which broke compressor and stator blades. This debris cascaded back into the engine, creating a path of destruction as it went. The engine's capability to produce thrust was gone. The aircraft's speed and momentum carried it slightly higher. When it reached 3,000 feet, gravity took over, and became the primary source of propulsion for this 151,000-pound airliner. There were few options. Sullenberger eased the stick forward into a shallow glide path to keep the airplane flying. Looking out the window, all that was visible was a sea of urbanization. The only open spot was to the left, a relatively vacant and flat area of the Hudson River. First Officer Jeff Skiles began pulling checklists and made several attempts to relight the engines. Sully eased the stick left, gently banking the airliner toward the river. Skiles continued attempting engine restarts. The aircraft cleared the George Washington Bridge by less than 1,000 feet. Both now knew they were gonna be in the river and began focusing on making that happen the best they could. The plane splashed down in the river with the fuselage intact. The crew immediately began evacuation, and nearby vessels rushed to the scene. In the end, all 155 people aboard the aircraft survived and were safely rescued. The aircraft was pulled from the Hudson River, brought to Charlotte, and is now on permanent display here at the museum. Above is a replica of the Wright Flyer. That looks like a Citabria. And some helicopters. A UH-1 Huey. Below, this one being an AH-1 Cobra, attack helicopter. A CH-53 King Stallion, used mainly by the Marine Corps, but also to a lesser degree by the U.S. Air Force. Tucked in next to the wall is a Boeing CH-46. This tandem rotor design dates from the 1950s. Here's a nice look inside. Now here's an oldie, an S-51 Dragonfly. These date from the 1940s. I thought this was an interesting item, a QH-50 Dash. Dash being an acronym for Drone Anti-Submarine Helicopter. These things were used in the 1960s. Carrying two Mark 44 torpedoes, these could be launched from the deck of a destroyer, flew out as far as 40 miles under remote control, and drop a torpedo on a lurking submarine, absolutely spoiling their day. Drones have been around for some time now. However, drones like this DJI Inspire have gotten smaller, much less expensive, and easier to fly over the years. Here's a Marine Harrier. The white aircraft up there is a D-558, an experimental jet that dates from 1946. There is an amazing collection of vintage and not so vintage aircraft in the main hall. Next, I'll take a look at what the museum has on display outside. However, that will be in part 2. Remember, life is a journey. Enjoy the ride, and thanks for watching.